In 1950, scientists recorded the first confirmed ocean dead zone. It was located in the northern Gulf of Mexico, off the coast of Louisiana, where the Mississippi River drains into the sea. The water at the bottom of that region had dropped below the oxygen threshold necessary to support most marine life, a condition called hypoxia. The zone covered a modest area. It was seasonal. Researchers noted it, documented it, and moved on. By 2004, the United Nations Environment Program counted 146 ocean dead zones worldwide. By 2008, a more comprehensive study catalogued 405. The most recent global assessments, incorporating data from ocean monitoring networks, satellite observations, and research expeditions, have identified more than 700 hypoxic zones in the world's coastal and open ocean waters, a number that has increased roughly fivefold in the span of 6 decades. The Gulf of Mexico dead zone, which started the count, now covers up to 22,000 square kilometers in its peak years, an area larger than the state of New Jersey, and it returns every summer without fail. The Baltic Sea contains one of the world's largest permanent dead zones, covering roughly 70,000 square kilometers of seafloor, where conditions have been persistently hostile to most marine life for decades. Dead zones have been recorded in the Black Sea, the Chesapeake Bay, the coasts of Scandinavia, the waters off Oregon and Washington, the Arabian Sea, the Bay of Bengal, and dozens of other locations where, within living memory, the water was oxygenated and productive. The mechanism that creates them is not complicated, but it has a property that makes it one of the most difficult environmental problems in ocean science to address. Once a dead zone establishes itself fully, the conditions that sustain it are self-reinforcing. The system does not simply recover when the inputs that caused it are removed. It has to be actively rebuilt. And in some cases, it may not be possible to rebuild it at all. To understand how a dead zone forms, you need to understand one thing about how oxygen gets into ocean water. Unlike the water in a well-stirred aquarium, the ocean is not uniformly mixed, it is layered. Warm, less dense water sits on top. Cold, denser water sits below. The boundary between these layers, called the thermocline, acts as a barrier that resists vertical mixing. Oxygen enters the ocean primarily at the surface, through contact with the atmosphere and through photosynthesis by phytoplankton. For that oxygen to reach deeper water, it either has to be carried there by currents that mix the water column, or the deeper water has to upwell to the surface and reoxygenate before sinking again. In a healthy, well-mixed coastal zone, this circulation keeps oxygen levels adequate throughout the water column. Marine animals at every depth receive enough dissolved oxygen to breathe. The system is not perfectly efficient, but it maintains the conditions necessary for diverse aquatic life across the full depth range. When nutrients enter the system in excess quantities, primarily nitrogen and phosphorus from agricultural fertilizer runoff, sewage discharge, and atmospheric deposition, the surface layer responds with explosive growth. Phytoplankton multiply faster than the food web can consume them. The water surface turns green with algal bloom. And when those trillions of algal cells run out of nutrients and die, they sink. The sinking organic matter, an enormous pulse of dead plant material, settles into the deeper, calmer water below the thermocline. Bacteria that break down this organic material consume oxygen as they do it. In a well-mixed system, the oxygen would be replenished from above faster than it is consumed, but below the thermocline, replenishment is slow. When the bacterial decomposition is intensive enough, when the bloom is large enough, when the thermocline is stable enough, the bacteria consume oxygen faster than it can be replaced. The dissolved oxygen drops. It drops further. Eventually it falls below 2 milligrams per liter, the hypoxia threshold, and the zone becomes inhospitable to most marine animals. This is not a slow process. A dead zone can establish itself in weeks, following a large nutrient pulse and a period of stable stratification. The Gulf of Mexico dead zone forms every spring and summer when Mississippi River discharge peaks and the shallow coastal waters warm and stratify. It persists through the summer. In most years, autumn storms mix the water column, break down the stratification, and allow oxygen to return. The fish and mobile animals that fled return. The zone temporarily recovers, and then the following spring, it forms again. The self-reinforcing aspect of dead zones becomes apparent when you look at what happens to the seafloor. A seafloor in a healthy coastal zone hosts a community of bottom-dwelling animals, worms, clams, crustaceans, sea stars, that live in and on the sediment, consuming organic matter, churning the sediment through their feeding activity, and in doing so, cycling nutrients back into the water column and maintaining the structure and permeability of the bottom layer. This community is called the benthic community, and its activity is called bioturbation. When hypoxia descends to the seafloor, the benthic community cannot survive. The mobile animals flee if they can. The sessile animals, the ones that cannot move, are eliminated. The seafloor, which was previously a living, actively cycling environment, becomes a flat, structureless surface of accumulated organic debris. Without bioturbation, the sediment no longer cycles nutrients the way it did before. It compacts. It becomes layered and anoxic in its own right, and it begins to behave differently in a critical way. It stores rather than releases certain nutrients into the water column in a form that promotes further algal growth. In particular, phosphorus, which in oxygenated sediment is bound to iron compounds and held in the sediment, is released in its bioavailable form when the sediment becomes anoxic. The dead zone, by eliminating the benthic community and making the sediment anoxic, creates a phosphorus reservoir in the bottom sediment that feeds algal growth at the surface. The algal growth produces more organic material. The organic material sinks and is decomposed. The decomposition consumes oxygen. The hypoxia expands. The benthic community remains eliminated. The phosphorus continues to release. The algal growth continues. This is the feedback loop. The dead zone, once established, generates the conditions that maintain and potentially expand it. Reducing nutrient inputs from the land, which is itself a politically and agriculturally complex undertaking, may slow the algal growth and reduce the intensity of the hypoxia. But it does not immediately restore the benthic community, which cannot survive the existing conditions, and it does not flush the phosphorus from the sediment, which continues releasing regardless of what happens on the land. The Baltic Sea dead zone has been developing for decades. Nutrient reduction efforts have been ongoing across the Baltic watershed for years. The dead zone has not recovered. Models suggest that even under optimistic scenarios of sustained nutrient reduction, the deep basins of the Baltic may require many decades to return to oxygenated conditions, if they recover at all, given the increasingly warm surface waters that intensify stratification and make vertical mixing less likely. Open ocean dead zones present a different and in some ways more fundamental problem. In coastal dead zones, the primary driver is nutrient input from land. In the open ocean, where land influence is minimal, the driver is warming. As ocean surface temperatures rise, the density contrast between warm surface water and cold deep water increases. The thermocline becomes more stable. Vertical mixing, the mechanism that carries oxygen downward and brings nutrient-rich deep water upward, slows down. The ocean stratifies more strongly. The oxygen minimum zones that naturally exist in certain ocean basins, regions at intermediate depths where oxygen is consumed by decomposition faster than circulation replenishes it, expand. Oxygen minimum zones are not dead zones in the coastal sense. They are naturally occurring features of ocean circulation, present in every major ocean basin at depths of roughly 200 to 1,000 meters in certain regions. But their boundaries are not fixed, As warming intensifies stratification and slows the circulation that supplies oxygen to these zones, their upper boundaries shoal, they move closer to the surface, and their horizontal extent increases. The habitable depth range for animals that need oxygen narrows from below. The most recent comprehensive assessment of global ocean oxygen, published in 2023, found that open ocean oxygen levels have declined by approximately 2% on average since 1960. In some regions and depth ranges, the decline is significantly larger. The oxygen minimum zone in the eastern tropical Pacific, one of the world's most extensive, has expanded measurably since systematic monitoring began. The implications for the animals that live in and around these zones, including the mesopelagic migrants that pass through them daily, are an active area of concern and research. There are animals that have adapted to oxygen minimum zones over millions of years. Specific fish species, specific invertebrates, specific microbial communities have evolved to function at oxygen concentrations that would be lethal to surface animals. The Humboldt squid, for instance, spends its days in the oxygen minimum zone of the eastern Pacific, using metabolic suppression to endure conditions that would be unworkable for most of its relatives. The hagfish, one of the ocean's most ancient vertebrates, tolerates hypoxia that would rapidly incapacitate most fish. These adaptations are real, but they are adaptations to a specific oxygen concentration range developed over evolutionary timescales. They are not infinitely flexible. As oxygen minimum zones expand and oxygen levels drop further, the species living at their edges face conditions that exceed their adaptive tolerance. As the zones shoal toward the surface, they encroach on habitats that have historically been outside the hypoxic range. And the species living there have no adaptations for low oxygen conditions, because low oxygen conditions have not historically been present there. The spatial compression is the problem, when the oxygen minimum zone from below and the warm, stratified surface layer from above both expand, the band of well-oxygenated, productive water in between narrows. The fish, the marine mammals, the seabirds that depend on surface layer productivity all compete for a shrinking habitable volume. The prey that support these ecosystems, the small fish, the squid, the zooplankton, have less space to occupy. The food web compresses spatially even if total productivity does not immediately decline. In the Gulf of Mexico, the dead zone has been monitored continuously since 1985. The data is unambiguous. The zone forms every year. Its area fluctuates with rainfall and river discharge, reaching record sizes in years of high Mississippi runoff. Efforts to reduce nitrogen loading from the Mississippi watershed, involving changes to agricultural practices across the entire central United States, have produced modest improvements in some tributary streams, but have not measurably reduced the dead zone itself, because the system has enough internal momentum, enough stored phosphorus in the sediment, enough established bacterial communities in the bottom water to sustain itself even when surface nutrient inputs decline somewhat.